Good morning, everyone. Could I ask everyone to stand up just for a second? And if you like, just have a stretch or to move your limbs a little bit, maybe like you would on an aeroplane if you've been many hours sitting down. I'm a great believer in the physical body and remembering that we have one. Academics are quite bad at that. Okay, thank you. Please make yourselves comfortable again. It's been a morning of lots of content, lots of sessions. This is the last one before lunch. I'll try not to go on too long. I'll start by saying a huge thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a massive pleasure to be here. It's my first contact with OpenLearning. It's also my first time in Malaysia, so both of those things have been wonderful. I've learned a huge amount in the time that I've been at this conference here. It's been a fascinating experience. I was delighted to see the puzzles out the front. Apparently one was, I don't know if this is actually true, but I was told that one was put there in my honor, the one of London and Big Ben. Puzzles are fantastic things. The great thing about it, if you're doing puzzles with lots of people, is that the puzzle gradually gets made. I think to finish it, we might have needed a few more days of conference. The puzzle gets made, and in the end, you have this beautiful picture, and you don't know who put in the pieces. There are no names on it. It's something that we create collectively. This is quite a good reflection of academic knowledge, that academia is full of ego. People are always wanting to put their names on things and have themselves cited. But if we're honest with ourselves, academic knowledge is constructed collectively. But just for the record, the clock face of Big Ben, that was me who put those pieces in. So, just in case you're wondering. Okay. Much of the work that we've been looking at in this conference, the work that OpenLearning is doing, the different speakers, is about transforming what universities do, about creating new kinds of space for teaching and learning, thinking about learning in new ways and how to link in with people's lives subsequently. I'm going to address an altogether more radical question now, which is not what would happen if we transformed the university, but what would happen if the university ceased to exist altogether. And it's an issue that has been touched on in some of the panel we've just heard, in terms of bypassing formal degrees and qualifications, and of its an implication of the transformations that technology are bringing to education, that this could happen in the future. It may seem like a distant horizon, given the extraordinary expansion of higher education that we're seeing globally. So we've moved from 10% of the global population going on to some form of tertiary education in the 1970s to 20%, the turn of the millennium, and we're now up to 37%. So higher education is in an extraordinary period of success and expansion, but at the same time, it's gripped by a crisis, and we've been hearing through the different talks in this session some of the ways in which this perceived crisis is, of lack of relevance, of ossification of forms of teaching and learning and knowledge creation and so forth. And the implications of what I'm going to look at today, unbundling, are perhaps that the university might no longer exist, or at least not in the way that we know it. And the question I want to pose is, does that really matter? Are we just being attached to the past? Is it just a kind of a knee-jerk conservatism that we might worry about that? Perhaps it's no bad thing, and we need to open the door to new forms of higher learning that may not take the shape that the university has traditionally. Or, if there is something to be saved, why is it? What is it about the university that might actually create some kind of coherent whole that we might want to save. There's I'm sure you're familiar with Sugata Mitra. You've probably seen his TED talk about hole in the wall. Very inspiring story of knocking a hole in his office in Delhi, putting a computer screen there and a keyboard, and the process through which very poor slum-dwelling children taught themselves how to use computers. This idea of self-directed, non-intrusive learning, very inspiring for many people. However, reports have come out years later, observers, some research studies that have taken place, that going back and visiting some of these installations of computers, of a rather different story being told. Many of these hole-in-the-wall computers are located within school premises, so there's a kind of creeping institutionalization there. Many are broken, dilapidated. Observations of what happens in these computers, you can see groups of children, but the ones closest to the screen are boys, and the ones absolutely closest to the screen are the tallest boys, and the smallest ones are around the outside, and what they're doing is playing games. What I want to show from this story is the fragility of the possibilities that technology holds for us, and this was a theme that was taken up in the keynote earlier today. Technology opens us huge possibilities, but it also carries great risks. And the aspect of that I want to focus on is the ethical aspect, the social justice aspect today. Does the revolution, the so-called revolution of unbundling of higher education, actually contribute to social justice or represent a more insidious form of inequality in terms of learning? And what I'll suggest is that it's poised on a knife edge, and it can fall either way. And it really depends on the way that we work with these new tools and these new possibilities open up to make it fall one way or the other, as is the case with the hole in the wall. I'm not going to answer the question, to gaze into a crystal ball to answer whether and how quickly unbundling is going to take place. I want to focus on the normative implications, as I said, of what the implications would be if it did. Is it actually something to worry about? Should we really be concerned? I'll start by looking at something of the backdrop to unbundling, the global conditions under which it's happening. Get into some of the detail about what forms it takes in higher education, and finally turn to the implications. And I look forward to hearing some of your reactions to that afterwards. Okay, when we're looking globally at some of the developments that underpin these changes in higher education, we can see a dual scenario. On the one hand, tremendous possibilities of new forms of democracy and collaboration, and Wikipedia is a great example of a completely non-commercial platform which has effectively put commercial encyclopedias out of business. People use Wikipedia, they contribute their time in a voluntary way. It's a wonderful example of the possibilities of a new form of human interaction, which is not based on greed, which is one based on sharing, and is a fairly reliable form of knowledge, even though not true of every single entry, of course, but gradually it has been a tremendous success. And then we have the more nightmarish side of these developments in technology about increasing surveillance and control over individuals, the theft and sale of data to manipulate and to actually counter these democratic tendencies. So these are some of the backdrop on a global level which higher education is strongly implicated in. I'm going to focus on the idea of unbundling, which is disentangling a bundle of higher education. And of course, this term is taken from business. And I want to start by looking a little bit at the types of bundle. Because if we're thinking of higher education as a bundle, and we are starting to sell the different components individually, which is the core of unbundling, it's important to distinguish between different kinds of bundle. And I can identify three types of bundle in this form. There are convenience bundles, tie-in bundles, and interrelated bundles. And this can relate to any kind of product that we have in the market. Convenience bundles are ones which bring a benefit for the consumer. So the obvious example there would be something like a package holiday. Okay? Instead of having to look for all the components separately, I can go to someone who will conveniently sell me a flight, a hotel, and perhaps a range of interesting touristic destinations to visit. And this brings a saving of time for me as a consumer and perhaps a saving of money as well. So it's in the interests of the consumer. Tie-in bundles, on the other hand, are ones that are in the interests of the producer. So this is a way of covering the costs of producing all the different elements by actually forcing the consumer to buy the whole lot. So we can think of the example of software packages where instead of buying a single one, you have to buy the entire suite. Some people here use the example of the old music album. If there's anyone in the audience who is of a sufficient age to remember such a thing, we used to buy a record or a CD with a series of tracks, and some of them you could buy as singles, but not all of them. Personally, I find this is not a very good example. I still hold to the idea that a music album constitutes a whole, and actually the journey through all of the songs was a special thing. But anyway, perhaps that's a very old-fashioned view. From some perspectives, at least, a music album is also a tie-in bundle because you're forcing the consumer to buy less popular songs as well as the chart toppers. The final kind of bundle is what you might call interrelated. And this is one where actually it only makes sense having all the different components. You can't actually separate them off and sell them because the consumer actually needs all of the different parts. An example might be IKEA furniture. You could conceivably buy all the different parts separately, but it would make no sense because actually, without the screws, your bookshelf simply won't stay up. It's of absolutely no use to you without any of the actual components. The reason I'm drawing these distinctions is that it makes a very big difference what kind of bundle higher education is. The assertion is, of the proponents of unbundling, that it is a tie-in bundle. That actually the bundle of higher education is forcing consumers, in this case students, to purchase things that they don't need. Okay. If it's, on the other hand, an interrelated bundle, or perhaps a convenience bundle, and it's actually in the interests of the student or essential for the student to have all of those components, we're looking at a very, very different kind of scenario. And the process of unbundling may be very dangerous. So this is the scenario with which we're faced. A whistle-stop tour of the history of the university shows interesting movements to and from forms of bundles. So the medieval university, of which Cambridge is an example, had some bundling, but it was much more reduced than the kinds of bundling we see later. So what you can see in those very early forms of university is that we have teaching provision, we have accommodation for students, so we can see some things starting to bundle together, libraries and so forth. So there is a very kind of reduced package. And then we move through the Humboldtian University in the 20th century, where you start to have research, a new function for universities, joining onto the teaching one. And finally through to what Clark Kerr in the 20th century calls the multi-university. Sorry, the multiversity, I beg your pardon. An incredibly complex institution which not only has teaching and research and community engagement, the three pillars of higher education, but also a range of other services, hospitals perhaps, spin-off companies, huge amount of different forms of student support and so forth. An incredibly complex institution. And when we talk about unbundling, it's largely this multiversity that we're talking about. And the process has largely been brought about by this. Okay, so if we're looking here at prices in the United States from the 70s until the present day, and this blue line here is the average price rise here, because it's something below 300%. Medical care's gone up a lot, housing and so forth. Look here at university tuition fees. An absolutely extraordinary rise above levels of inflation during that period. And this is the primary cause of inflation. What we have is a combination of expansion in enrollments, and I've already mentioned this, a very rapid expansion in enrollments throughout the world, along with extraordinary rise in costs. Some of which has been caused by this kind of thing. I don't know how many of you have been lucky enough to go on a lazy river. There's one at Alton Towers water park in the UK. I'm sure they have some. It's an absolutely wonderful sensation. You know, you can lie on one of these sort of rubber rings and you glide gently around a lazy river. And obviously essential to an undergraduate degree. Or so many universities in the United States believe. This is one of the ways that universities in a marketized system try and attract new students. This symbol I've actually taken from Ryan Craig's book on unbundling, where this is a symbol that he uses to show the superfluous and unnecessary in the competition to recruit students. The kinds of things that simply aren't essential, and the kind of thing that needs to be unbundled. Okay, so here just taking you back to those different forms of bundle there, an example of what we might think of as a tie-in bundle. University leaders in the United States talk about the 4 R's. Rankings, research, real estate, and RAR, which is a rather strange one, but RAR apparently refers to athletics, these sort of supporting for all the American football teams and so forth. None of which have a tremendous amount of relevance for students and their learning. Okay, so this race, this proliferation of expensive facilities and the competition to rise up the rankings with very little impact on student learning has led to the entrance of new kinds of providers with a much lower cost product, absorbing the demand that can't afford these extremely expensive Ivy League and other institutions, and leading to a perception of crisis. So this is just to give you an idea of the rash of books emerging. These are ones you can see from the titles here. Crisis of student debt and escalating costs, and leading to what some have called a revolution in higher education. This report, An Avalanche, is coming, produced by Pearson executives, step into the wake of this crisis to present what the future should look like for universities, an unbundled future. And this is a picture of outsourcing of a range of services and a new way of unbundling and repackaging services for a new age, with the entry of a range of private providers and a series of characteristics, many of which have already been highlighted in this event. We can actually think of unbundling at a range of different levels. You can even look at it at a systemic level of unbundling the system of higher education, but this is quite unusual, so I'm not going to focus on this one primarily today. The main ways in which people think about unbundling are at the institutional level. So here we can talk about separation of teaching and research. The rise of teaching-only institutions is a major phenomenon of contemporary higher education. Most of that very rapid expansion that I mentioned since the turn of the millennium have been in teaching-only institutions. So research either doesn't take place at all or it moves to other kinds of institutions. Next form of unbundling is at the level of the course. And here we can see obvious examples in online learning. So unbundling at the course level looks at how design, delivery, and assessment, as well as other aspects of the process, start to take place with different actors or in different locations or even with different organizations. And the movement of validation of knowledge, which has always been a key role of the university in awarding, in accrediting learning, awarding degrees, and also validating academic knowledge through journals, starts to move away from universities and through micro-credentials that were mentioned in the previous panel, start to take up other positions. Lastly, we can see unbundling in terms of academic staff. So the traditional professor, at least the Humboldtian professor of the 19th century that conducted academic research with academic freedom and also taught at various periods of the history of the university, also had a pastoral role in looking after students. This bundled academic staff member starts to separate out, and you have a series of what Bruce McFarlane has called para-academics, who have very specific roles in relation to students. You have separate staff for research and teaching, perhaps, and even within that teaching role, quite distinct roles. So we can see here unbundling taking place at various different levels. Many of the proponents of unbundling point to the fact that through new technologies we can actually transmit what are called stars, so your globally famous academics to, instead of just a lecture hall of 100 or hundreds of people, to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Well, this is true, of course, but it's not possible to actually pedagogically interact with that number. So mostly proponents of unbundling propose then a cadre of tutors who will also be involved in the interactional element of learning. So you have instead of the integrated academic staff member, you have a combination of stars and tutors for this model of learning, generally speaking. MOOCs, of course, are a key component of unbundling. And they lead us to, in their most radical form, to a complete deinstitutionalization. So I want to distinguish now between three kinds of unbundling in higher education. There is a use of MOOCs which is institutional, that can be part of the credit-bearing offering of an institution, and there is a use of MOOCs that can actually take us beyond the university to a completely new form of higher learning that's outside the institution. I want to distinguish between three forms of unbundling here. The first is disaggregation. Okay? This is where all the functions of the university continue, but they're provided by different kinds of actor. So here we're talking about outsourcing of services. All the components of the university are still in place, but you have various different actors that are providing them, usually outsourcing to various private providers. This is the most common, well, along with the second that I'll mention. This is a very common form of unbundling in the contemporary world. Many public universities are also engaging in this kind of unbundling. The second is what I call no frills. This has a rather different flavor because here not all of the components of the university are actually being offered. It's a pared down version of the university that is more affordable, particularly to lower income students. Here we're talking at the simplified form of university. Your cheaper, usually private for-profit universities that are offering a pared down product at a much more affordable price. I'm not sure if Ryanair has made it out to this part of the world, or EasyJet. I'm sure you have your own budget airlines, Southeast Asia. I'm not familiar with the region, so I don't know what they are. But I'm sure all be familiar with the new breed of airline which does not offer you a choice of seat, does not offer you a meal or a reclining seat, gives you an infuriating online experience where you have to tick no to a range of very nice looking suitcases before you actually get to buy your flight. But it's an extremely cheap flight, and it has enabled a huge expansion in the number of people who are able to fly. So this is the no-frills product. The budget airlines are a very good example of this. And we're starting to see this model come into higher education as well. The point is, however, if you take a budget airline from London to Berlin, you get to Berlin. Do you actually get to the finishing point if you have a budget higher education experience? Well, that's a different question. And I think it's something we need to look very carefully at. The final form of unbundling is the most radical and for me the most interesting, and some of you in this room may be old enough to remember Ivan Illich and his book Deschooling Society. See just a few flickers of recognition there. If you haven't read it, it's a very challenging and interesting book. Deinstitutionalization shows us a vision beyond the institution of university. And unbundling particularly forms of MOOC which open up a new, non-accredited, unconventional form of learning, present this possibility that actually we could move beyond institutions at all. We could move beyond qualifications and engage in intrinsically and instrumentally beneficial forms of higher learning. The interesting thing about unbundling is that we have both financial and pedagogical drivers for this process. Most of the critics of unbundling focus in on the financial benefits because they're easy targets. Clearly, unbundling is a way of making profits. Many of the for-profit actors are moving into this area because it's a way of making large amounts of money. A lot of my work is in Brazil. Higher education in Brazil, the for-profit sector, private sector is about 75% of enrollments, for-profit sector is about half of that. There's vast amounts of money to be made, and I'm afraid to say it's made at the expense of students to a large extent. There's a huge amount of demand. People are willing to pay even for a very, very poor quality experience because they're desperate. They can't get into the public universities. They can't get into the expensive, high-quality private universities, so they've got no option. So there is a financial impetus for this that I'm afraid is against student interests. However, there are pedagogical drivers as well, which we have to take very seriously. And personalization has already been mentioned as one of these. Greater attunement to the labour market. We've had plenty of discussions about this already during this conference, so I won't labour the point. But they certainly, unbundling presents some very interesting pedagogical developments which do point the way to more effective forms of learning. But is the assertion made here by many proponents on unbundling actually valid? Education will never be the same, unbundled, less costly, and more effective. So move on to the final part of my presentation now, where I'll look at some of the implications of these processes. And bearing in mind when we're looking at implications, we mustn't forget that education, or what we commonly think of education, consists of two quite distinct things which often assume to be the same, but very often are not. And that's learning and credentials. We would hope that they go together, but obviously there is lots of learning that can take place with absolutely no formal recognition of that learning. And unfortunately, you can gain credentials with very little in the way of meaningful learning. I'm not just talking about in fraudulent practices, which of course exist, but even within recognized legitimate universities, there are ways of moving through to the end of the degree, obtaining one's qualification without much in the way of meaningful transformatory learning. And I think the discussions that we've had around employability are illustrations of this. So when we're thinking about unbundling, it might have implications both for learning, meaningful learning, and for credentials. And both of those have implications for social justice that we need to take into account. First point, what kind of bundle is higher education? One of the points we need to think about here is around synergies between teaching and research. Certainly, it's not essential for every university to be a research-intensive university in the sense of the elite, Nobel Prize-winning, high-ranked universities. But the atmosphere of inquiry and scholarship and research that all of those teaching in higher education can engage in is extremely important, and for students as well, that students are also engaged in processes of research. And I'm not, just to reiterate, I'm not necessarily talking about sort of research with a capital R, sort of big, high-profile, high-funded projects, but an atmosphere of inquiry and not simply transmission. Community engagement also highly important for academic staff and also students. The traditional university actually hasn't been always tremendously good at cross-disciplinary fertilization, but it's at least made possible with a multi-faculty institution. And it's very important to think in a holistic way about learning. Learning that takes place not only through the acquisition of content through a course, but in the various kinds of interaction. And it's been extremely interesting during this conference to hear about the very creative ways that people are trying to foster that kind of interaction through online learning in these courses. I do research in a large number of countries, including very poor countries in Africa and conflict-ridden countries, and often it's quite a disheartening experience. But one of the things that never fails to move me is the first-hand accounts that students give of their transformatory processes in higher education in encountering the other. Clearly, our universities are not inclusive of all in society, but even for those who do get to go to university, this experience of interacting with diverse others and to learning from that interaction is almost universal in terms of the research that I've done on different countries. How about learning? What are the implications of unbundling for learning? And the main argument I'm going to make here is what I indicated at the start of this very fragile, poised moment where learning could go either way. Unbundling presents for learning a vision either of greater democratization, more learning, more meaningful forms of learning, or it could descend into narrower and more impoverished forms of learning. So it's poised in a way that we as educators, as educationists, as educational developers and managers need to think constantly about how to move it one way or the other. And here, personalization prevents a huge amount of opportunities. And also a return of intrinsic and curiosity-based learning. Clearly, students, all of us have material interests and concerns, and employment is one of them. But we mustn't lose the fact that learning comes through curiosity about the world, about trying to understand the world, and to allow ourselves the possibilities of learning about things that maybe don't have an obvious or concrete use. So I saw that one of the MOOCs on the OpenLearning platform that attracted me was about coffee. In fact, there's been quite a lot of discussion about coffee at this event for some reason, and consumption of coffee. And the one on coffee was the one that most attracted me out of those. It might convert itself into a future career, but it's unlikely. Ivan Illich has an interesting concept of convivial tools. And I think this is an important way. So it's a strange term, and actually it's not a very usual use of the term convivial. But what he means by this is that technology, we mustn't allow technology to dehumanize us or manipulate us. That we need to think about technology as mediating to humanize us more, to mediate horizontal democratic relationships between us. And that's an interesting way of presenting this dilemma. Finally, implications for social justice. And again, we have something of a paradox here. Unbundling certainly has brought about an expansion of access. Even the no-frills model, the low-cost, low-quality forms of higher education, which we're seeing rolled out throughout the world, has undoubtedly allowed huge numbers of people to enter higher education who would not have been able to, either through public models, because of lack of state funding, or the high-cost elite forms of private higher education. MOOCs have also allowed an expansion of access to higher learning, although, as we all know, sadly, as yet, MOOCs haven't incorporated very large numbers of the excluded from higher education. Many people who do MOOCs already have degrees, or at least already have very high-quality schooling. It takes quite a lot of learner autonomy to be able to do a MOOC. So there's still a lot of work to be done to really make MOOCs inclusive of people who don't have access to conventional higher education. But certainly they represent a possibility. However, we need to remember that higher education is a positional good. The relative, it's not just about getting people into a higher education system, it's also about their relative position within it. All higher education systems that I've ever encountered are stratified. One degree is not worth the same as another degree. And again, here we're seeing the separation between credentials and learning. You may learn a huge amount, have a transformative experience, but many employers simply will select on the basis of the prestige of a diploma. Not all employers are as enlightened as the panel we had in the previous panel, where people are really looking at the individual and trying to gauge what they learn. Many employers do use proxies of, and if you have a degree from a particular place, then you certainly go to the front of the pile. So stratification in higher education systems is real, and the emergence of no-frills forms of higher education is, I'm afraid, exacerbating that kind of stratification in many countries. Also, the loss of the research and community engagement function from universities is also undermining their ability to engage in activities for the public good. Higher education will inevitably have private benefits, but we need it also to have public benefits. We need people through their work to generate public benefits, but also outside of employment for higher education to bring benefits to the broader population. Just a quick example to illustrate some of these points is Kepler in Rwanda. And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the Kepler initiative. So here we're talking about post-conflict context, a horrific genocide, a country that is making extraordinary efforts to rebuild itself. And Kepler's an example of an initiative which tried to, given the difficulties of expanding rapidly a public system of higher education, tried to bring very talented young people in Rwanda from poor backgrounds to have a high-quality higher education. So they brought together various MOOCs and online courses, brought it together, and the people on these courses actually gain accreditation from a US university. They get a US degree. Okay? So it's been a fantastic story of success. But it does bring us, it has some interesting lessons for us, on the other hand. First is that we start to see a process of rebundling. So we start with an unbundled model of young people, instead of going to a conventional university, bringing together a series of MOOCs to learn. But the organizers of the university realized that these young people didn't have reliable access to the internet. So they created IT suites for them. And they were too far from their houses. So then they created student accommodation. And they needed a lot of support because they had very poor quality previous schooling, so they needed instructors. So before you know it, you've got the traditional university being recreated. And you start to realize that actually many of those things that are part of conventional universities are there for a reason. Not all, perhaps, and maybe not the lazy rivers, but certainly many aspects of the university do have a real purpose. And if we get rid of them, maybe we'll have to bring them back in a different guise. The other thing that we do need to be very careful of is that these are young people in Rwanda who are accessing content that was not designed for people in Rwanda, does not reflect the cultural context, the knowledge traditions of the region, and is accredited by a university in another country, which brings positional benefits for those people, but effectively reinforces dependency of that region. So I think there are other cultural and geopolitical considerations that we also need to bear in mind with this kind of model. So just to finish off then, if we're going back to our three forms of unbundling, disaggregation presents certainly opportunities for traditional universities to ensure their financial viability by outsourcing a range of services. No frills, I will definitively say, is a very negative development for higher education, because even though it allows the expansion of the system for new populations, it inserts them in a lower rung of the system with very poor learning outcomes, very poor employment opportunities, and reinforces initial inequalities. However, deinstitutionalization does present some fascinating opportunities for higher education. Perhaps it will lead to the end of the university and new and richer forms of learning, or perhaps it will just lead to a throwing up of the pieces and the recreation of another kind of institution, but an institution that will more effectively be able to fulfill its ultimate purpose, which is to promote human understanding through teaching and through research, and in collectivities, and connecting back with the primary focus of this conference, which has been on the collective nature of the learning, and I would also add the research process, and the collective nature of doing puzzles, which I hope in the short time that we have left in this conference people will engage with, and we can get Big Ben built at the end. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCowan, for sharing your insights on unbundling education. So as a token of appreciation, I would like to invite Adam. Oh, Q&A, sorry. My apologies. Anyways, I saw some really interesting questions on Q&A on Slido. Thank you so much for posting your questions. So we have the first one, which has 3 votes. How can we ensure that MOOCs are more accessible to displaced people like refugees so that they too can have quality higher education?
This is a really, really important question. I mean, refugees, there are particular refugee contexts in the world that are particularly difficult, especially if we have contested border areas, and sometimes there are ambiguities about which system people are going to be in, if they are going to have access to higher education. So MOOCs present a tremendous opportunity in this regard. I think we need to think about 2 primary considerations here. First is the cultural question that I already mentioned. I think what we need to see in MOOCs is a much greater diversity of content. I don't just mean content in the surface sense, but a much greater diversity of language, of knowledge tradition as well. We need to do much more to move towards epistemic pluralism in higher learning. We've moved from a tremendous diversity of higher learning in the period up till 1000 of the Common Era. There were Indian traditions, there was Islamic tradition, there was the Mesoamerican tradition, the Chinese tradition. There were many traditions of higher learning. Very few of them have survived to the present day. What we've had is a kind of a homogenization of higher education to a large degree. There's some diversity, but there are many, many shared elements, and I think we need to move towards a much greater pluralism, epistemic pluralism, and MOOCs are a real opportunity to do that. However, it's very important that we don't assume that all people will arrive at a MOOC with the basic skills that they need to engage meaningfully with that content. Sadly, schooling systems in many countries do not provide people with the literacy and skills they need to engage. So I think we need to think about how people arrive at those and are able to meaningfully engage and get the most out of them.
Let's take one more question. Which question would you like to? Yeah.
Very interesting. I'm just trying to think which one of those to take first. Okay, how do we break the bundling hegemony? So I think to interrogate this, firstly, we need to think about the extent to which bundling is actually a hegemony. I think we need to look very carefully at the components of the university and to try and separate out what is actually meaningful and what is exerting a hegemonic force on the learner. Certainly not everything in the university is simply tying consumers into buying things that they don't need. If we think back to the rankings, certainly some of the competition around elite research, elite luxurious facilities for students are going beyond what is really meaningful and needed for student learning. And that aspect of the bundle that we might see in certain institutions may be seen to exerting an unfair or a hegemonic force. But not all aspects of the bundle necessarily have that. So I think we need to think very carefully about the institution and not go to either of those two extremes, either accepting everything about the traditional university because it's what we consider to be the university, because of its history, or what we might think of as the official components that our countries may consider to be part of regulation of universities. But equally not dismiss all aspects of the traditional institution by virtue of it being old. Not everything that's new is necessarily desirable, and I think we need to think very carefully about what aspects, and going back to the example of Kepler, what aspects of the bundle are actually contributing to learning, and what is in fact a necessary or an interrelated bundle. So what parts of learning, whether it be acquisition of knowledge, content, interaction with others, the ability to create and experiment, what aspects of those are actually part of an enriching bundle rather than one that we might think of as hegemonic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCowan. Let's give him a round of applause.